Hello everybody, Dave Thomas here again, and this time I'm going to build a rocket from scratch, although that's not quite as daunting as it seems because most of the rocket is going to come from a badminton shuttlecock or birdie. Now over the years, many of the major manufacturers of model rockets have come out with birdie type rockets. The one I'm familiar with currently that's still in production is made by R.E.A.R rockets, but I remember building these as a very young boy, and it's something you could do really easily if you have some spare parts laying around. So first of all, you're going to need some shuttlecocks. You can get these in most sporting goods stores or in department stores that have athletic supplies. I think this 6-pack was about $5 or so, so you can make a whole fleet of rockets out of that if you want to, or make this a group activity. We have a couple of challenges. The first is we have to be able to mount a motor mount in this, and this is all polyethylene and possibly polypropylene, so our standard glues are not going to work with this very easily. Now, depending on your shuttlecock, some have kind of a raised area inside here where the nose actually attaches to it. This one does not, it's relatively flat. But in some of those, you can actually take the motor mount and stick that directly over the piece that protrudes there. And then with a little bit of epoxy, that will remain in there. Okay. If you've got one that has a really wide opening here like mine does, you're probably going to need some centering rings. Okay. So here I've got an assortment of centering rings, and in my case, it looks like this one, which is meant to center a BT5 into a BT50 tube, is going to fit in there quite nicely, like that. All right. I do recommend that you only do this with 13mm motors. I don't think it'll be very stable. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not stable if you put a full 18mm motor in there. Part of the stability on this relies on keeping most of the weight forward to keep the center of gravity forward of the center of pressure. Okay, so I'm going to use this centering ring in there, and then we're going to need some BT5 body tube, and I'm going to go dig that up, and we'll come back in just a moment. Okay, so here I've scrounged up some BT5 body tube. I also have a dummy motor here, so this is an A10-3T casing, but I filled it with clay, but it still has the same weight that a fully charged A10 would have. And one of the things I want to make sure of here is we want to minimize the weight that extends backward here. Okay, so basically we want to have a minimum amount of body tube that we need to keep the rocket safe. All right, so if we measure that, all right, our 13mm A10 is 4.5 centimeters long. What I'm going to do is give myself a whole centimeter of overhang space. So I'm going to cut my mount tube here at 3.5 centimeters. Okay, so here I'm going to just measure this. And if you're going to build the whole tube at once, you can go ahead and just cut a whole bunch of these. All right, so there's 3.5 centimeters. Now, to give yourself a clean cut, you can either wrap this with some masking tape so you have an edge to go by, or you can use these tube marking guides or cutting guides that Estes makes. These are actually really kind of cool. I think they were well worth the investment. All right, so you just slide that on and slide that piece over, and then I can just take a hobby knife here and cut all the way around the edges. Now, one of the other things, if you're just going to build one of these, and maybe your cut edge is kind of a little bit raggedy, put that edge up forward in the rocket where nobody's going to see it. So when this is installed, the motor is going to fit all the way up to the forward edge there. Put it in forward just for giggles. Okay, and then this will be hanging out. And so that's going to fit inside there. Okay, I'm going to put my centering ring on top of that. Okay, and so it's going to hang in there like that. Now, hopefully, you're thinking ahead and thinking about, well, what about a launch lug? Okay, for this type of a birdie, we're going to have a little riser on there for the launch lug, and so we'll come back to that. But you will need a little scrap piece of balsa. Other birdies have different geometries up in here, so that sometimes you can just drill through right at the edge there and stick a flush launch lug on there. Okay, so I'm going to take this back apart. For this part, I'm going to need a little bit of wax paper here to protect my surface, and then we're going to glue on the centering ring to the motor mount. And for this, you can use white or wood glue. Okay, so here I'm just going to apply a bead on the outside edge here. All the way around. And try to avoid getting it on the inside. Okay, then we're going to put that ring on there, and I'm going to stand that up and push everything down on the wax paper there and make sure that it is perpendicular. And then we're going to need to let that dry completely. Alright, the next thing we can do while my glue is drying is to build a standoff then for our launch lug. And so we need to take a few things into consideration. So that launch lug is going to have to go past the ring here, definitely. And then we're going to have to add a little bit more on there to make sure that it gets out to the point where ideally our launch lug will be right underneath one of those big holes there. Okay, so you can take a ruler or calipers, and I'm going to use calipers. Okay, so I've got some digital calipers here. You can use analog ones as well. You can actually get some of these as cheap as about $2. I think this digital one was about $25. If you're going to do a lot of your own building, though, and designing, it's a good thing to have. So what I'm going to do first of all is measure, and I don't think I'm going to do it there. I'm going to measure it from the outside. Okay, so right along there. All right, so I'm getting it right at where those holes are. Okay, and that's giving me 2.94 centimeters, and it's blinking at me because my battery's dying. Okay, so I'm just going to write that down here. So we got 2.94. Okay, now the outside diameter of our tube is about 13 or 1.36 there. Okay, so if we subtract that, that gives us, let's see, 1.58. Okay, and then if we divide that by 2, because we're only building it out one way, so that would be, okay, we got our 1.58. Alright, and we divide that by 2, that's going to give us 0.79 centimeters. Okay, so that's how deep, or how tall I should say, our standoff is going to need to be. So now if I measure here, Okay, that's coming out at about 1.8 for a strip going along here, and that just happens to be serendipitous. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just cut a strip there. Try to keep this as square as I can. Alright, so it's going to be about 0.8 right there. Okay, now this can't be any longer than that, so we said that was at 3.5 centimeters. So now I can just measure that out. I'm going to make it just a little shorter so that I don't run into the glue on there. So we're going to call this 3. Alright, so my glue's still drying there, so I'm not going to do this too much. Okay, so that gives us just enough and takes into account the thickness of the centering ring there. Alright, so now I'm going to go to my bag of launch lugs. Okay, so this is a standard 1 1/4 inch Estes launch lug. So we're not quite there. It's probably not really worth it to bother with trimming off that piece, so I'm going to leave it there. So now I'm going to glue that on. Okay, and now go ahead and just like you would with any other, sight down along it. Make sure it's straight and centered. That looks pretty good. So I'm just going to set that aside. Okay, and so now we really have to wait for all this glue to dry. While we're waiting for the glue to dry, we can prep the surface here. Okay, so we're going to have to use epoxy to bind the cardboard of the centering ring and the motor mount to this really slick, it's probably polyethylene. Okay, and there are epoxies out there that are specialized for plastics, but even those are not going to stick well to the smooth surface of polyethylene. So one of the first things we can do is roughen up the contact surfaces where that's going to go. So basically anywhere that the cardboard is going to touch. Okay, I'm using an emery board here. You can use a small file, you can use some sandpaper. But you want visible scratches in there. And I think I'm going to go ahead and use a file. There we go. And make make sure you get all the little pieces out, because they could interfere with the glue setting properly. Okay, so now we're still waiting on glue to dry, and I'll come back in just a little bit, although in your time, right away. Now that the glue is dry on all of our parts, I'm going to do a test fit here. So we'll take that off the wax paper. That needs to go in like that, and then our launch lug needs to go in beside there. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so if we look at this closely, that launch lug should be very close to the hole there. And if I recenter that, okay, we will need to cut out a little bit of the webbing in there. But that looks like it's right about where it should be. Okay, so here I'm going to go ahead and glue the launch lug on. Now, I don't have any type of a guideline on this since it's so small. But if you want, you can go ahead and draw a straight line down the body tube to help you align it if needed. Okay, that looks pretty good there. I'm going to set that aside to dry once more. And now I'm going to take my hobby knife here and just cut out a little bit of one of these sections. Let's see if I can do this without upsetting my glue. Okay, so it looks like one of the things I'm going to have to do is offset this a little bit. So I'm going to take my launch lug there and just pull it down a bit. Okay, that way it'll fit. Now here, I will probably go ahead and trim off that excess, but I'll do it after the glue finishes drying, since I have upset it a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let that dry, and then once that glue is dry, we'll come back, trim off the excess there, and then mount it into the shuttlecock. Now that the glue is dry on the standoff there, I'm going to go ahead and clip this back. I'm just going to use my hobby knife here and cut down through. Got a little bit of a crunch there, we'll fix that. Okay, now if I put this in, okay, so that's the forward part of the ring there is resting squarely against the top of my birdie. Okay, and the launch lug is completely clear of obstructions. Okay, so I'm going to just add a little bit of a fillet here on my standoff and the launch lug. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and cover all the balsa there, because I'm not going to bother with painting this. also help reinforce that little crunched area there. Come on, a little bit more. There we go. Okay. So pretty much our last task then is to glue our motor mount assembly there into the birdie itself. And I'm just going to use a small amount of 5-minute epoxy for this. And I really can't think of a good substitute because we do need something that is going to stick to the plastic in here, which remember we roughed that up. And will also stick to the other materials that we're using. Okay, so we're just going to stir this up. Now we don't want to have too much of this. We don't need a big plug of epoxy ending up in the motor mount, because that's going to move our motor backward. We want to keep our motor as forward as we can make it. Alright, if you're a particularly sloppy person with epoxy, I recommend wearing gloves, because it can cause skin irritation. Alright, so here I'm going to mostly put that epoxy around the scratched area that we made. Okay, and then also down into here. Now again, I don't want a big pool down there, but having some, in my case I've got that kind of a ring around the end there. And I want to give that a fair amount of epoxy there, because that's got little irregular surfaces in it that the epoxy can grab to. Alright, and remember, you've only got a few minutes working time with this. Okay, so once you've got your epoxy applied, remember to move to the cutout area there so that our launch lug still fits correctly. Alright, and then just press that whole assembly down. Alright, and I'm going to hold this for a couple of minutes while the epoxy sets. So here is my finished shuttlecock rocket. Okay, see it went together pretty simply there. And again, the trimming here you may or may not have to do. Okay, and in fact, the reason I went ahead and showed how to do this and how to modify things as we go along is because depending on the brand and type of shuttlecock you get, this is not going to be exact to yours necessarily. Now when you're ready to go out and launch this, 13mm motors of half A size or larger. Quarter A's will not move this very far, and possibly not even off the launch rod. And try to keep the delay time as short as you can. By its very nature, this is not very aerodynamic, but it is very stable. Okay, so hope you had fun building this, and you can even try this with lots of other ones. As I said, once you've got the basics for yours down, it's not very difficult after that to make more of them, as long as you're using the same birdie there. So have a great launch and a safe recovery, and please stay tuned for more of my videos.